Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Today we're going to be talking about cells and tissues. So at this point we're still on the basics of anatomy and physiology. This is the last chapter before we get into the different organ systems. If we come over here, if you remember from the first chapter that we talked about levels of structural organization. At this point we are now going to be talking about the cellular level. In the last lecture, we talked about atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, and make up atoms, and then go on to build molecules. Molecules are larger structures of organization made of different atoms. In particular, we talked about organic molecules. Those are our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. These organic molecules then come together to form cells. And remember that the cellular level, this is the smallest level of organization that we still consider a living thing. So molecules, organic molecules, even though they make up cells, they themselves are not living things, nor are atoms. So we're going to start here and talk about cells, and then later in this lecture we'll talk about tissues. And that's going to end our introduction, our overview of some of the components of organization. And then from here on out, we're going to be talking about organs and organ systems. The rest of the chapters and the rest of the time in this class, we'll be looking at different organ systems. But it's very important to understand this basic stuff, to understand the chemical, cellular, and tissue levels in order to understand the organs and the organ systems. Just like when you're learning about anything, if you don't understand the basics, it's going to be very hard to understand what's happening in the organ systems. So we're going to look at these the cellular level here today. And the concepts that we learn are going to become important when we're talking about the different organ systems. Now let's come back here to the different parts of the cell. And I recommend for you to use the online resources, the internet, and the links that I've put up to go in and look at some different websites about the different types, the different parts of the cells, their functions, and those sorts of things. We're just going to have a brief overview today, but I do want you to know these parts of the cells. Best way to learn them is to go and do some of those exercises there where you're having to remember the different parts and what they do. Okay, now every cell, our body is made up of a lot of cells. So if you were to count, if it was possible to count all our cells, they would number in the billions and the trillions of cells that make up our body. So you can imagine how many different functions these cells are carrying out in our body. And because of that, because of all the different functions that our body has, not all of our cells are the same. They have the same general characteristics, but within that there's going to be some variation that allows for different types of cells that have different functions. In this part of the lecture, we're just going to look at what we would call a general cell, and then from there we'll look at a little bit about how different cells may vary in this normal or this generalized structure. All cells do share one thing, and that is that they have three regions that are found in all cells, and those are listed here. We have the nucleus, we have what's called the cytoplasm, and then we have the plasma membrane. You can kind of see in this picture how the nucleus is situated inside the cell. The plasma membrane is talking about you might think of it as the skin of the cell. It's the outside membrane of the cell. The cytoplasm is everything that's inside. It's the liquid inside of the cell. So we have the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the plasma membrane. Let's take a look at each of these a little bit more in more detail. Here's the nucleus. So remember where it's found in the cell, and this is a blow up of that nucleus. Notice that the nucleus has a membrane around it as well. So it's an actual compartment found within the cell, separated from the rest of the cell. It has a double membrane, if you can see that here. There's an outside membrane and an inside membrane. And then it has these pores as well that allow substances to move inside and outside the nucleus. We have what's called the nucleolus, and then we have chromatin. Okay, chromatin is the important thing here. Well, it's all important, but it's the most, when you think of nucleus, you think of DNA. So the nucleus is where the DNA is housed inside the cell. The DNA, it's a nucleic acid. Again, this is the information holding molecule of the cell. So theoretically, if we could take a cell from you, it doesn't matter what cell, any cell from your body, and we could remove that DNA from a cell, we could take that DNA and replicate you. So all the information to build you, who you are, all the functions that go on inside the body, all that information is held within the DNA. So you can see how this is a very important part of the cell, and it's a very important part of the it is what is being held inside the nucleus. The nucleolus is a condensed part of the DNA that has a separate function. On the outside here, we also have a rough ER. Notice how the rough ER is continuous with the nuclear membrane. So here the nuclear membrane is coming out, and it connects onto this rough ER. We'll talk a little bit more about the rough ER a little bit later here, but notice there are also these little dots on the rough ER. That's why it's called the rough ER. Those are ribosomes. So here's the nucleus. Every cell in your body, except mature red blood cells, and we'll look at that a little bit later in this semester, but every cell in your body has DNA. And it is that DNA that tells the cell what to do. Okay, the cytoplasm, remember, is everything around the nucleus, between the nucleus and the nuclear membrane. It's the liquid-filled center of the cell. And then we have the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane has a very important structure, a very important function, because the plasma membrane is what separates this cell from the outside environment. So remember that we talked about previously about the idea of homeostasis, and we said that living things have to separate themselves. They have to have some sort of barrier to separate themselves from the outside environment. Without that barrier, there's no way that the cell would be able to maintain homeostasis, because our outside environment is much different than the environment we need inside our cells to be a living thing. This plasma membrane is what provides that barrier. It's what provides the mechanisms to allow homeostasis to be carried out, to occur. So what this means is that if you wanted to kill a cell, probably the easiest way to kill a cell is to puncture that plasma membrane. If you were somehow able to put a hole through the plasma membrane and make a way for everything to flow inside and outside the cell, so you no longer have this barrier, you no longer have this wall around your city or around your cell, that will kill the cell because it's no longer able to maintain homeostasis. And interestingly enough, this is what a number of drugs do that we take to fight bacteria and infections and things like that. So bacteria are cells, they're living things, they have a plasma membrane. So as we take these drugs, what they do is they will puncture this plasma membrane and in that way kill the bacteria. This is also how some of our white blood cells in our immune system function as well. So I want to point out a few parts of the plasma membrane here because it is very important. First of all, we have these little guys here. Notice that if we were to blow this up, it looks something like this. We have a head, and then we have these two little legs, and one of the legs has a nice little kink in it. In the last lecture, we talked about a type of organic molecule called a lipid, and one of the types of lipids we talked about was a phospholipid. This here is a phospholipid. Notice our plasma membrane is made up of a layer of phospholipids on the outside, and then there's a layer of phospholipids on the inside. So they're one on top of another. So it looks something like this. And then they form these large sheets. This is what our plasma membrane is made of. This is the fundamental component of the plasma membrane. So remember in the last lecture I said that the reason this phospholipid is interesting is because it has a hydrophilic head, meaning that it likes, philic meaning likes, and hydro meaning water, so it likes water. And then it has a hydrophobic tail. Hydro again meaning water, and phobic meaning scared of or dislike. So the phosphate head here likes water, is attracted to water. The hydrophobic tail repels water. And what this does is it gives the plasma membrane some very interesting characteristics, because within this cell, in the cell's environment, notice that this is a watery environment on the outside. And the cytoplasm on the inside is also a watery environment. If you look at the phospholipids and how they are situated, notice that the hydrophilic head is pointing towards the watery extracellular fluid, and this phospholipid head here is pointed towards the watery cytoplasm. And so what you have is you have a hydrophilic outside, hydrophobic layer on the inside, and then another hydrophilic layer on the outside. Is you have this what we call a phospholipid bilayer. So two layers of phospholipids packed on top of each other. So what this means is that when things that want to get inside the cell have to go through this hydrophilic and hydrophobic phospholipid bilayer. And sorry, I was just looking here, I forgot an H. Phospholipid bilayer. This provides a barrier, and a little bit later in this lecture we'll look at cellular transport and things moving outside the cell, and we'll see how this phospholipid bilayer is able to create this barrier, provide this barrier in the cell. Some other things to point out here. Here's cholesterol. So these little 4 carbon chains hooked together, these little yellow molecules here, are cholesterol. Again, in the last lecture we talked about lipids. We said that cholesterol is a type of lipid, and it's located, one of its functions is to be part of the phospholipid bilayer, the plasma membrane around the cell. So every one of our cells in our body has this cholesterol inside that plasma membrane, and that helps to give this plasma membrane structure. These phospholipids, they are lipids, fundamentally. A lipid is an oil or a fat. And so the fluidity of our plasma membrane is very similar to olive oil, if you can imagine. So we like to think of our cells as being somewhat solid structures, rigid structures, but the plasma membrane is essentially the same fluidity as olive oil. So what these cholesterol molecules do here is they provide some rigidity. So they provide some structure for this phospholipid bilayer. Then we also have proteins that are stuck inside. These big purple molecules here are proteins that are stuck in the membrane. And notice how this protein has a hole or a passageway through it. So these proteins have a number of functions. They can function as a doorway. So if this phospholipid bilayer is our wall, this is a doorway that can allow certain things that our cells want inside or certain things they want out of the cell to move inside and outside. So that provides that. Notice here that this protein, this purple protein here, has a little carbohydrate chain stuck on the end of it. And we call this a glycoprotein. Glyco meaning the sugar. So it's a protein with a sugar attached to it. So basically our cells have a sugar coating. And you'll notice here this is a glycolipids. This is another sugar, but it's connected to the lipid, the phospholipid, so they call it a glycolipid. So we have the sugar coating on the outside of our cells. It has a number of functions. It can function as, one of the functions it has is to identify the cell. So just like our body as a whole has a fingerprint, every cell in our body also has a fingerprint, and that is provided by these carbohydrates that are attached to the cells. This will become important when we talk about immunity. The way that our body recognizes which cells are ours and which cells are not is with this fingerprint, this glycoprotein. So if you were to get a transplant or a blood transfusion or something like that, the doctors are going to make sure that your fingerprint matches as closely as possible the fingerprint of that blood or the organ that you're getting. And then the other thing to point out here are these filaments of the cytoskeleton. Inside the cell, just underneath the plasma membrane, so the cytoplasm is inside the cell, we have these protein filaments that give the cell structure. And we call this cytoskeleton. Skeleton, so skeleton, just like we have a skeleton in our body that gives us structure, allows for movement. Our cells, each one of our individual cells also has a cytoskeleton inside the cell that gives that cell a certain structure and allows for movement within the cell and those sorts of things to go on. So this is what the plasma membrane looks like, some of the components of the plasma membrane and their job inside the cell. We're now going to look at a generalized cell here, and we'll see some of these components again. So here's our generalized cell. Notice here is our nucleus that we already talked about. The nucleus houses the DNA. Around that nucleus we have rough ER. So all this blue material with the little red dots on it, the ribosomes, that's rough ER. Here we have what's called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So we have rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER, so we often abbreviate it because it's such a long word. And then we have what's called smooth ER. So they are both endoplasmic reticulum, but they have a little bit different job. We have the cytosol, which is the fluid part of the cytoplasm. The mitochondria, notice the little mitochondria, kind of a bean-shaped organelle here. And notice that it has two membranes, an outside membrane and an inner membrane that's very folded. We have what's called the Golgi apparatus. This whole green area here is the Golgi apparatus. We have the plasma membrane around the whole cell that we already talked about. But notice here that the plasma membrane can have some different structures as well. We have here a folding in the plasma membrane that we call a microvilli. And this fold is given its shape by a microfilament, which is a type of the cytoskeleton. A microtubule and intermediate filaments, these are all part of the cytoskeleton, which we just talked about briefly. Different types of filaments that make up the cytoskeleton. We also have a lysosome here. Notice the lysosome. And then we have also something called a peroxisome. Okay, these are the major parts, the major structures of the cell. We call them organelles. Notice this word here. So if our whole body was a cell, within our body we have these organs, these compartments that have different jobs. So our cell itself, as a living thing, it also has these compartments. Each of these compartments is called an organelle. So the nucleus is an organelle, the Golgi apparatus, the rough and smooth ERs, the mitochondria, these structures are called organelles. So I want you to know these organelles, the nucleus, the rough ER, the ribosomes, the Golgi apparatus, peroxisome, cytoskeleton, mitochondria, lysosome, and the smooth ER. These are the organelles that I want you to learn and know their function. We'll talk a little bit about them here in just a minute. Centrioles are not organelles. You can see them here, but they become important when we talk about cellular division, and we'll see that here as well. Microvilli is also not an organelle. It's just a folding of the plasma membrane. Okay, so in the next few minutes here, we're going to go through some different functions of some of the organelles inside the cell, and then we'll get into some of the different cells. We'll look at cellular division and those sorts of things. So since we've already been talking for about 20 minutes, why don't you, at this point, we'll end this recording, but before you go on to the next recording, I'd like you to take some time and go over each of these organelles that I pointed out here, write them down, and write down what their function is, just their general function in the body, and then start the next recording, or the next part of the lecture, and we'll go over each of these parts of the cell.